Once I just arrived, soy Adriana Jacques, profesora de I'm the professor of the modern Hebrew, and I'm going to be presenting Jacques Lezra. He's going to be talking about Borges, Derrida, and the untranslatable words. He has been working of Hispanic works in the California Riverside University, and he has a wide variety the studies of translation, literature, and the visual area aspect of Europe and in the modern area. His newest books we find the followers, Microphilology, Untranslated Machines, a genealogy for the ends of global thoughts, and against all of the forests of the death, the Serpentine Success, and Lucretius and Modernity, co-edited with Lisa Blake, among many, many others. So, as well as many articles and essays in the main portions of his field. As a translator, he had a bold demand into Spanish, and with the Michael Woods, he is the co-editor of Dictionary of Untranslatable, the translation into English of the Vocabulaire Européen Philosophie of Pakistan. So let's welcome Jacques Lezra. Thank you, Adriana. You can hear me right?
Ahora,
Better?
mejor, mejor.
Okay, now it's way better, right? Well,
Bueno,
this
esta charla tiene como título El tipo
is called
español,
the
Borges,
Spanish type,
Derrida
Borges,
y
Derrida,
Keynote.
and untranslatability. And I would like to thank the organizers of this seminar, the challenges of translation, to the University of Chile, to Global Humanities Institute, and to the National Museum of Fine Arts, where we are gathering today. And behind the institutions, the people that has organized this meeting, they are here today, and also to the interpreters who have the task, which is not we're not jealous about their job of translating this probably untranslatable text, the Spanish type. Um, we're not looking for nationalisms that will allow us to say that the typical Spanish, if such, it is not translated, cannot go from the Spanish as the Castellano to the Chilean, and of course it is untranslatable into French, English, and so on. So that is not. So the text that I'm going to present is to present a proposal that has to do with two areas, one that is emerging and the other one that is way old. So what it is interesting is the relationship between these two that are the philosophy of the untranslatability and on the other side the meta theory of the value. It means the basis on which it is established without having a proposal, without having an argument that can be declared of being a theory of this value. All of these formulas would be controverted, dark, and the relationship among them it is more so. I understand the word value in all its senses, but here is the economic value, and hope that some translation into other registers will have an spontaneous translation in the sense of moral value, and with all of the explanation that this kind of translation may present, that is kind of spontaneous, kind of uncontrollable. The definition of untranslatability that comes from the traducibility and also the method theory of the value differs from the known definitions that Barbara Cassin and also Emily Apter. Please remember that for Cassin, the untranslatable, it is not what we cannot translate, but what cannot be continually translated. I mean, that it is not going to be given and that we cannot maintain or defend a certain translation. Now we'll continue in two areas. So first of all, I would like to tell you what is this problem of the traducibility and also with the form and the value of the global capital. And now I would like to show you what is the value in the articulation and the untranslatability in this case, text of Derrida, and this is called that the Trotter regards that show us a group of documents of photographies, and here we have a text of Borges, which is called Los Espejos Velados, hand copied with various the characters that also in they took a picture of it. You can see the picture, but it was no attribution and no signature of the author among this object. If it is handwritten and pictures and the series of photos and the text of Derrida, we've got a scheme when we've got some sort of a narrative or a Babelic representation with some sort of alternative presentation that we will call the untranslatable, the Spanish type. So I have to really accent this accent because this is the real accent, and this is a way of thinking beyond the crisis that we're living in the contemporary political aspect. It has to do with the value of the global capitalism. First of all, the untranslatability today. What is it? What is it about? Concept has been around since the translation exists, since we have had the human languages, but it has a specific shape that gives an articulation of the practice of translation in the globalization of well, in the area of philosophy and the political philosophy, the untranslatability works as a device. Excuse me, I'm having a problem here. But in the case of the philosophy and the political philosophy, the untranslatability works as a device that can mark the outside, that articulation between globalization and translation, or better yet, the translatability and the globalization. And the most powerful device, the aspect with the most powerful project, is the one that drives Kazan in the vocabulary of beyond the Philosophie Dictionary, the Intraducible, published in French in 2004, and then in Russian, English, Castilian, and also in Brazilian and also in Arabic. And now we can see an edition in Chinese as well. But what was the target with this dictionary of the Austrian level? What is this point in this global capital? Well, the sentence given or such a word or a certain composition are known as translatable when they can be expressed in another language, of course. But then we've got difficulties. First of all, we've got a potential suspect, and the problem is not such or it is an overwhelming banality. So, what we want to define as a translatability, it is not really the generalization of the project in terms of a communication. It means the problem of being expressed to another person regardless of the language difference. I'm saying this that it is cold. I wrote this when I was not cold, but we have to see how it is adjusted to the circumstances, the words that you write the day before. I'm saying it is cold, and I'm saying it's in Spanish, not in Chilean, or maybe it is. We will have to check that, but you can understand what I'm saying. The expression is translated, but to me, I live in LA where the temperature do not go that down. The expression it is cold. It doesn't have the same objective reference as it does for you. So what we are communicating is a subjective experience, a series of symptoms, some phenomena that regardless of having certain identities will work and works good enough so for you not to think that I'm crazy and for you to understand why I'm having or not having in this case a code or why my hands are shaking. We don't need a semantic identities that are clear. We need to have an approach that are part of the cultural validation that we understand. If I'm saying it's cold or il fait froid, it is not the same situation of the translation, but we need to understand that the French and English expression, and also you have to say that this is English or French, but knowing this, the thing is translated, the thing is expressed, and the mechanism is of the communication in general, or even more. Something of this thing is expressed, it is expressed what is necessary, what is enough, so we can say that there is communication and it is understood as an expression. It is called hace frío, il se fue. The translatable is then what is expressible or what we communicate, and if we left this spirit a criteria of the identity that is never applied in the language or in the common communication, there is no such a thing or expression that is not in principle, saving some differences that we give for granted, untranslatable. There was no problem given that a sentence as it is called without the need of continue translating. And of course, we wouldn't be in the situation that Cassandra describes of a word or an expression that cannot continue being translatable. No problem, as I say in English. And this no problem allow us to affirm today in the universal language, English or the Hollywood language, that no problem that except for some local differences or even by including them and given the differences an added value, but can be calculated in each time. The general translatability that we see through the language and the expression and has the exact manner of the global market in which the goods circulates and also are produced in such an area to be consumed in another with different values but related. The translatability of this value is not subject to identities. Certain goods may be more, having a higher price or less in a certain place. It can be one thing according to their cultural framework, the history, the ecology, their local resources, but the differences, maybe they add or reduce the value according to the principles that will be revealed and in the same terms universal, the principle or the syntax of the global market. However, there is a problem, even bigger, the philosophic, economic, and political one. Let's agree that not all of the expressions are part of this banality of it's cold or even this is a Spanish person is more complicated. And let's agree that there is no principle given to these to yeah, the expressions of, let's say, more complex ones, the one that will allow us to be there without an endless translation. So we can see some examples of untranslatability. A sentence such as, the spirit is a bone. We take it like this as nothing from the spirits of Hegel. The problem is before that comes for the lack of definition of this object to be defined. So this or expression of this word can be expressed in another language or probably in the same language that you and I manage the Spanish, the Castilian, and the Chilean. I'm not saying that it can be translated to this one, so I'm not going in the tautology in the trap of defining. It means that what is translatable is what allow us to translate what the translation allows. I am saying this that this sentence of word can be expressed, and I'm hiding under the voice some other problems. So what is this possibility about? This possibility of expression? What is expressed? what we can translate. If that is the case, and it is in terms of the identity of the sense of the expression, the original and the translation, the identity of the use that it has or its function. We have seen that it is not possible. This is not identities. And necessarily, no, because the use and the sense and the function of this or that expression will depend on a framework and also from extrinsic in ideas of this sentence that will not be identical of one language to another or from one instance to the next one.
The translatability is or is based on the statement that between this sentence or word and that who expresses it, something impossible to express happens, something impossible to translate that we are skipping when we decide to translate or when we express ourselves and when we decide to communicate, for instance, that it is cold or that the spirit is a bone. This leap that we take when we abandon the criteria of identity to move on to our universal pragmatics cannot be philosophically satisfying, obviously, but the philosophical satisfaction is not the greatest good either. The point is that if translatability necessarily leads the hypothesis of something impossible to translate, at the same time we are opening up to the possibility, not to the possibility, to the need that there are things whose value cannot be given or expressed in the universal of the market that don't fit precisely in the model of what we can communicate that would allow possibly to find an outside to the universal of the capital and philosophically speaking to the universal itself. The untranslatable hypothesis that has the great danger that I have mentioned earlier of falling into the ontological nationalism or the linguistic essentialism, the hypothesis of the untranslatable concerns way too much the contemporary philosophy as well as the universal market. There are and also to say that a certain expression in English is untranslatable because it is in English allows us to state that the particularity of the language would not allow needs political devices in order to be reaffirmed or protected. A wall, for instance, populism, nationalism, concentration camps, the ideology that comes from a US that wants to become great again. So we are looking to affirm the untranslatable hypothesis without falling on this idea of nationalism. Now, as a contrast, let's take a look at the three devices that philosophy offers to fight the untranslatable hypothesis, and that it offers what I was calling the universal market or the universal of the market. The analytical philosophy, in its formal vocation, supports itself either in the idea of translatability of the natural language to the symbolic language, or on the thesis, also a priori, that the philosophical proposals can only be given in a formal language. What could be called more generically the philosophy of the ordinary language is based on the thesis of the general pragmatism of the communicational situation that we described earlier. There aren't any philosophical proposals themselves. There are actions of words among individuals or communities with effects that are more or less predictable, and the criteria of truth and other classically philosophical criterion are subject to the regime of the pragmatic world. And finally, phenomenology, as we said earlier, offers the hypothesis of the world, which is a shared experience in which, for the lack of objective identities that this statement refers to, in the lack of this, there is universal of the relationship between a transcendental I who is empty and the world that this I experiences. The hypothesis of the untranslatable would accompany the translatable as an experience world that accompanies the transcendental person, it would be subject to the same transcendental reduction. But I don't want to spend any more time in any of these philosophical positions that are interesting, of course, but they do not help me to think directly about the issue that concerns me, which is the relationship between the meta theory of the value, the translatability, and the untranslatability. Let's take a look at the response that offers the so-called the global market to the untranslatable hypothesis, and the answer it was has been called the globish, which is a term that I'm not sure if you've heard before, but well, this is a term that Wikipedia has defined as an international auxiliary language which is artificial, and also the subset of the English language formalized by Jean-Paul Negrier that consists in a subset of the standard grammar of the English and a list of 1,500 words of English. And according to Nerrier, this is the common baseline that non-native of the English speakers adopt in the context of international businesses. Thus, globish, which is a hybrid of the globe with the English, which is a word that is global English, the globish that does not seem to to respond to the other three ideas of philosophy. Actually, possibly globish doesn't exist in itself as a language. It is nothing but a trend of the market of the markets, a trend that only by virtue of the capital device is translated into the good, even already forgotten, which is called globage. In any case, the philosophy of the globish wouldn't even exist, nor the globish philosophy, and of course, any philosophical approach or paraphilosophical approach that we would like to use to take a look at the globish would not be expressed in globish, because to explain globish we would have to use, or we would need to use, grammatical patterns or terms that could precisely fall outside of the common baseline that non-native speakers of English use in the context of international businesses. Now, this last point isn't a definitive objection. If there were such a thing as a philosophy of the Castilian Spanish, it wouldn't need to be expressed in Castilian Spanish. The language that we use when we talk about one or another language doesn't need to be the same as the language that we are talking about. Actually, there would be a proposal, let's call it Wittgensteinian, that would insist that the language that I use to talk about one or another language couldn't be that language itself, because the objects of the object language in the ordinary use are the objects of the world that is at the reach of our hands and are not linguistic objects at all. The language that I use to talk about language is a language which is, as Wittgenstein says, on holidays. The worker who is on holidays is a creature which is different from the same worker, so called worker, sitting at their desk or on site or at the university classroom. The Globish, which is an invention of the global market to facilitate global trade, is the last radio of the principle of translatability. The world that it creates and that it reflects, the world that it describes, is the typical world, the world which is comprised not by singularities but by types of objects, things, or proposals. And here the expression world comprised by means a system of types of objects related to one another according to typical rules, objects that are part of a syntax of types. The globish never goes on holidays. It is never summertime. It always works. Even when we are not talking globish, it produces market. It is a good and it is a value producing machine. A certain good has a certain value. It has different values even within the framework or the local market. But within the general framework, within the globish of the typology of the syntax of the general market, global of markets. The globish means this expression of the capital as a universal value, as a universal system of value and creation of value. The globish expresses in itself the ultimate fantasy of the capital, the ultimate fantasy of the existence of the universally productive worker, which is predictable, which never goes on holidays, that has a fixed position, that doesn't accumulate value, and that does not resist the extraction of the value from the product of their work. That is the language, that is the globage, which is endlessly untranslatable, and that is what the global capital is aiming at. And now let's formalize, on the other hand, the untranslatable hypothesis. And let's start all over again. I have in front of me the text of Derrida of 1985, a lecture, regard. And there isn't a full translation into Spanish of that. You are going to have to trust me on this one. And in this text, there are two speakers engaging in a dialogue, and I'm going to quickly pace through this. There are two speakers engaging in a dialogue. There is a you that possibly the reader or the readers of the philosophical dialogue refer to, even though the pronouns always allow for certain confusion with the pronouns that the characters of the dialogue would have. So Derrida explains the emergence of the characters in the set of pictures that are used to organize or to capture a subset of encounters or events. Two couples of women, a man and a woman, two little girls, a checkers game, a mysterious lady, a mysterious woman that writes in a notebook, a woman that is going out of a building, subsets, micro suites, generic. So apart from the bodies that are dressed and naked of the pen and the notebook, of the checkers board, the objects of the scene are a bed, certain of the encounters. I won't show you those pictures. I invite you to take a look at those yourselves. It is a bed because certain of the encounters are rather erotic. There is a glass, cigarettes, a camera, a picture, a mirror, the house itself, which is huge and empty, the mansion in which the action takes place, if there was an action. And the word generique that Derrida uses means the credits of the film, the titles at the header or at the foot that explain how to allocate the responsibilities, the names, the parts, and they can also mean, according to the translation or the declaration, the clarification of the translator, an introductory proposal or a productive proposal. So the relation of generic with Genesis, genealogy, and gender in all of their meanings is definitely there. So there is something that indicates gender. There is a generic that offers what is generated as it relates to a gender or a type to the extent to what the generic offers. Now let's call this new depth, which is to believe in a type that a certain individual has or is granted at a certain moment, and when a second photography happens of what seemed to be a singularity. Now, regarding this new deepness, Derrida writes, I'm not sure whether to read this in English or French, but you have it in your text, and I will read it in Spanish. Regarding this new and false death, which is uh, which is in the second picture, it will be revealed in the following sequence. So there is a new or there is a second or third generic that thus just made its appearance, and I will call it the Spanish type. And this is the sequence that I have here of pictures of the Spanish type. This is the Spanish type. This is the Spanish type, right?
As well as his partner that cut the Spanish type, and that is going to be the written language or of the photograph language, the photogram of the next part, some Spanish words on a page. That is exactly this one. Some Spanish words on a page. Between those two Spanish, we've got a tin, a broken glass, and that drinking glass that announced another broken glass, the glass of the picture, the frame, the mirror, the scene of the Spanish type develops these generic photographs. It brings it to life. I will return in brief to this Babylonian strange blizzard picture, and has to do with the reading, and of course, it is not what is expected of Derrida, because it is not very common of its work, and it's not part of these ethical stereotypes that this description offers of the Spanish type. The drama, violence, hospitality, gravity, the passion, jealousy, and even the most savage violence. That is for the Gallic imaginary, the European for the imaginary of the dark legend. That is the Spanish type. Let's remember Marimé, David Gautier, Carmen de Bizet. And for the French type, the Spanish type always makes a scene, always breaks the glass, the drinking glass, the glass protecting the photograph, the glass mirror. And what a most disaster when only one is Spanish. We've got two Spanishes, a man and a woman, even two. And this is in their own stage. I don't think that you have seen the link between the Babylonian narratives, and I'm trying to see it for the genre of Lissat and the theory of the meta theory of the value. This is where I'm going because we have seen it and it has appeared, but it is hidden. The bubble story. This is the gender and the type that we can identify and we can classify it and we can evaluate the narrative about the translation and the translation of those narratives. Every theory of value offers a bubble theory, every bubble theory, and offers a theory of value. Every theory of value of bubble is a theory of translatability and of untranslatability. I explain myself. I understand that what we don't like, what is called this Western modernity and the hegemony of the imaginary global capitalism, it is the synonymous and contemporary of when this value is losing sense and when the value is set by anything and the thing commodity object and more regarding the relationship of those entities with other things and other uses of such things in any or other context to whatever the target is. Let's say that in the Western modernity it is typically built as a transcendent axiology. If we take the technical definition object of the transcendence, the value of this or that thing is defined according to the criteria that do not arise uniquely from or are set or are saturated with the thing or what establish the value of that thing. Thus, the value of those commodities is determined by two things. Relatively, by a two-step translation into the community relation to a general equivalent, and then to other commodities also translated and at the same time it has appeared in an universal translation and also relatively as an absolute deriving this value that is absolute of the absolute use of this commodity. Let's say that in this case that the value of this of that commodity is the use of this in a specific moment in a specific circumstance. The translation in its two hyperbolic forms, on one hand, a form that is justified by a principle of the universal extendability and the universal translatability that the genre offers, and on the other hand, moved and limited by the principle of universal singularity and of the genesis and the use, and they offer the simile of the form and value that is transcendental of the Western modernity. Please pay attention. The translation described in its two hyperbolic ways of the universal translatability of this exchange. I will have to repeat this part because it's terrible. I'm so sorry. But let's pay attention. The translation of translatability that is defined in these two hyperbolic ways of the universal translatability and the universal singularity of the generic word of the use. This translation, it is something that is more than a symbol. It is something else that a way to define the value form of the Western modernity. Translation is not only the concept that the global capital supplies for understanding how the value and thing and preposition is established. It is at the same time the device in which that value is set, the linguistic translation and cultural will model the accumulation and dissolution of the value according to this goes from market to market or from a certain moment of production, consumption, distribution of what I am manufacturing of the word that I'm saying about that thing. The thing that I am manufacturing of the sentence about it, not only in its own, but also in the way that this is going, and that will have the signature of the moment of the different languages that will go, and the source language and the target language, and only by this is the thing, and my enunciate will have a value. Anything may travel in this way, gain or lose value across markets and linguistic contexts, and at the same time, nothing travels unchanged and continues with itself across the discontinuous global field of the market of markets. To the extent that these things or my statement about it remains recognizably, and it means that the extent that it can be identified in translation as a repetition of a statement or as this thing that has in fact traveled, it has been untranslatable. When they acquire a typicality, they will be revealed as untranslatable. This hyperbolic point of view that can be irreconcilable but symmetrical operate at every moment in shaping the market of markets. They set the scene that we call the globe or globalism. The instability of the value form that they offer determines the possibility of escape and capture that makes this capitalistic regime endless, and this is an endless subject for crisis and contingency. The theory of value that is proper to the global capital is the theory of the relationship between translatability and untranslatability. Or to be more precise, it is the theory of the gender of that relation, a theory that proposes that the relationship between translatability and untranslatability works according to type, according to the gender. And this scheme that I just summarized at a terrible speed. We will call it the bubble paradigm. It is the one that I have been finding in some previous works, but today I think it is not enough. Self criticism, if you're interested in hearing this, but I think it is not sufficient because it doesn't offer a perspective from which we can imagine the end of the capital, which is also the end of the universal paradigm of translatability. To imagine this, we have to go to another scheme which does not add to the terrible hypothesis of the untranslatability and the hyperbolic and symmetric value of bubble. Is an hypothesis of translatability. The Spanish, once again, it goes with the bubble paradigm, but this is the scene. He's breaking the glass, the mirrors, when we've got the regulator gender, when we've got this paradigm that is repeating it and reflecting it, he and she. And we've got the Spanish type. First of all, without having the gender, just here, this is the type is español. Yeah, Spanish type, that is also for the written language. At the center of this Blizzard photograph, it showed that this image of a woman that is writing. But what is she doing? What is she doing? Is she transcribing her thoughts? And it would be a classic idea of the inspiration based on Dante. It is what it says in the area 24 of the Purgatory. I am one love is inspired. I can see it. Love inspires me inside. I noticed that, and then I mean, the Spanish type thinks, transcribes what they see inside in Spanish. But this woman is not copying also a text that she remembers, she knows by heart. And this is an index of the thinking. This is the Spanish type having this in. Is this look? This is she's looking into the horizon. She's taking notes of what her thoughts represent, and she invents these words of the Spanish types as if they are given for granted in the principle that holds this suite of photographies and hairs will be part and the generic rule and the paradigm. Probably she's taking note of what her thoughts represent photographically as photogramming them, representing the thoughts, spelling them, and probably translating them from the identical area from the photography to the photogram from one language into Spanish. And what she's writing is Spanish, isn't it? Derrida says a little bit before that you don't have to know Spanish to understand something that is being written because what he or she writing the female or the male type of Spanish, the French or the Latin a genesis of the Spanish and in without knowing Spanish you can guess because it is a generic resemblance and there is no need of knowing Spanish to write in Spanish. The Spanish type the type of has been written or even the writing itself it is given when you don't know in which languages you are writing so then If we can have a reading or a reading itself, we will say that it is given when you don't know or when you don't need to know in what language you are reading. As instead of the process of revealing of a photographic image, this is a develation or probably to show or probably to revealing this specific language, the reading and writing itself, revealing in the languages of this language, or probably this woman is reading here and there, where the objective of the camera capture her, where this produces as an object for the objective. She's writing as she's reading thoughts in the surface of the lens, in the target. Does she imagine or think or translate or transcribe in a mechanical manner? Her name, or Derrida named her as Pilar. It is a proper name, but under as these revealed, we can see that we know the noun Pilar, and also Pilar also goes together with a certain virgin. The virgin of the Pilar, the function of a Pilar consists in generating and to support as a pillar the writing that is revealed, this type, the Spanish type. Well,
I have brought to you nothing but uncertainties. Pilar either writes, remembers, copies the text from Borges, Los Espejos Velados. This is something that we know or we remember, although the fragment appears unsigned. The mimesis of spontaneous writing, as well as the copy of copying, at the center of the suite of photographs. The recollection of the fragment doesn't solve any of the problems, and it doesn't give answer to any of the questions offered by the Spanish type. She, Pilar, is Borges' proxy, perhaps, but then we're free to ask about Borges, whether as he writes Los Espejos Velados, he thinks or writes or remembers or copies. All these predicates that we applied to Pilar are now applied to Borges as well. Or maybe the mimesis of a spontaneous thought in the encounter between Pilar and Borges is meant to recall that other great and defining moment when copying, thought, translation, and recollection meet. Borges' own Pierre Menard. How infinitely richer Pilar's version of Los Espejos Velados is than Borges' veiled original. Recall too that that original, Los Espejos Velados, tells the story of a woman haunted and driven insane by Borges' image, or perhaps, we will never know, the belief that Borges' image haunts mirrors, which is a symptom of her insanity instead of the cause. Pilar's repetition, composition, copying, recollection of Borges' brief fable then places her in that text as well, and it puts us there too, recollecting it with her and recollecting the image of the author's signature, crediting Borges with the authorship that Pilar possibly took. What a scene of reading and writing these two different Spanish types are staging. Borges and Pilar, the Spanish of Borges and the Spanish of Pilar. If indeed what Blizzard is photographing here is a scene, broken glass, broken mirrors, a battle of the sexes between the Black Queen and the precursor that she thinks or remembers or replaces or unthinkingly and mechanically transcribes, every sort of struggle is staged in the suit of predicates that conform and disaggregate the value of, and the value, determining the value of the Spanish type. They are all multiplying and generating all types of violence and encounters. The scene, that is set up between Pilar and Borges, the scene of reading and writing, as we have seen already, isn't it also the scene of the passionate encounter of two Spanish types, or of two types of Spanish, the internal and the external, recollected and composed, Porteño and Castilian, the inspired and others? Spanish and French as well, this mechanism of simultaneous confirmation and disaggregation spreads, we might say, in every direction towards the relation that the writing and the language and the type, which is the Spanish type, has to the veiled original, if it is the original, and towards the characterization of the writing or the character, again, the Spanish type as a type. Let's take a look at the homophony that Derrida exploits between l'Espagnol, who is the character, and the Spanish, the language. And let's recall the words that I quoted earlier. Another photo that will be the sequence that I will call the Spanish type. And yes, there is a man for the first and last time, just like his couple. He has the Spanish type. The Spanish type will also be the type of the written language, more so the photographed writing, the graph photogram of the following sequence: Spanish words on a page. Between the two Spaniards, there is a scene. We barely need to know any French. It's possible to guess, and it's possible to remember that one type and set type are also nicknames or ways of characterizing this or that person, as when we say in Spanish, a Spanish guy, a Spanish person, a French person, an Arab person approached me. So the expression a type is key in the text. Even the word type that organizes the reading of Derrida of the pictures, but that more broadly gives us that pass between the value of the image as a singularity and relative value. Type is no longer one to become more than one type. So a generic type that is not distinguished from others, a guy among other people, just a person, or just no one. And also one person, this person in particular, that embodies the typical of all the types as a paradigm of what's typical, the carrier, therefore, of the genesis and the genealogy of all the types, because they all together comprise this type, the Spanish type, a type which is given to passions, jealousy, drama, etc., the Spanish type and the type of the Spanish. And to separate, what's impossible to separate the Spanish type and the type of the Spanish are unveiled one from the other. The individual, unmarked individual, and representative, typical, general summary of a class to which that type, that individual belongs. So it's impossible to preserve them together or to embody both types at the same time. So where the Spanish type takes place, it shows, it unveils hand in hand with Pilar, and it shows the other Spanish type, which is a so-called Borges, where the Spanish type is a guest, in which we metropolitan Parisian speakers we read Spanish without knowing Spanish, and it veils the hand of Borges. Behind the Spanish type, there is another Spanish type hiding. We need to know Spanish just enough to remember that the word velado, veiled, and uncredited by signed by Borges, a spectral hand, means the word velado, it means both muffled or veiled. The mirrors in which Julia insanely sees Borges' image reflected must be veiled, for his face replaces hers. Likewise, we would like to say that the signature of Pilar would seem to erase or veil Borges' signature in Blizzard's suite, which is a mirror.
Recordemos
So let's recall those who have the Spanish type. Then what is veiled? It is also veiled once again in grieving what has been what has disappeared remains. So the veiled title of the works that are copied or written by Pilar, Los Espejos Velados, that also refers to the grieving of the mirrors, mirrors that a certain Spanish type has destroyed, that are veiling the photograms of Blizzard, espejos velados that were offering more than they should, the face of Borges or the signature of the Spanish type behind that paradigm. Also, espejos velados or broken mirrors, veiled mirrors that are destroyed, which is a typically Spanish scene that we set up on stage in order to grieve them. The grieving of the mirror as marking its absence, its lack of mirrors that goes back to referring to grieving the mirrors. We have put on the scene next to the paradigm or the type of Babel, the Spanish type of narrative. And next to the narrative, the Spanish type or genre in which the normative value of the type is reconcilably split. Beside the broken tower stands a veiled pillar, like the ruin of a ruin. Or to put the matter less allegorically in conclusion, I suggested that the theory of value proper to the global capital is the theory of the genre of the relation between translatability, and thus that the relation between translatability and untranslatability works accordingly to a type or to a relation of the type of a primary relation. The hyperbolic positions of a tendential universal translatability and tendential universal singularity or untranslatability destabilize the value form and determine, that is, generate the gender or type that serves as norm for the structural capture and fight that makes global capitalism endless and endlessly subject to crises and contingencies. But the Spanish type, always along Babel's companion, always on the scene, always making a scene, the Spanish type unveils the gender and the generic of types. What I was describing earlier as the Babel paradigm, which is capitalism's permanent crisis capture contingency, is, I think, the expression of capital itself, and this is unveiled by the untranslatable hypothesis, which is the Spanish type. And by unveiling this and veiling this, it offers different genders to go beyond the catastrophe of the capital. Thank you. Now I'm going to be moderating the conversation. Thank you so much, everyone. And if I may, I read an English version of this text, and I also read the Spanish version, and I'm very interested about thinking about this idea of the globish regarding the academic discourse and this passage between English and Spanish as thinking about this idea of the untranslatable in connection to the globish and how the academic discourse is also another type of globish and at the same time untranslatable. Every entity has its own globish, I would say. They have their own language, the language that is the valid language, which is specific to this entity. The globish, as I said earlier, expressed this idea of the universality of the capital, and it was also a way of establishing that position. And also, it is expressed, strangely enough, or it also expresses the key fantasy of the capital, which is this idea of the worker that never complains for the extraction of the value of their work, that they work endlessly, they never take a break, and they are part of the big machine, which is the capital. And I would say that this concept of an academic discourse internationally, for instance, that discourse that makes this very meeting possible is a way, is just another way of another expression of the globish that expresses a fantasy which is as old as the university itself, which is that at the university the nations or the nationalities of the different groups get together to speak the humanistic Latin that everyone can use to express the same ideas and to communicate with one another. So I believe that for the academic world, for the world of the university, there is also this idea of universal standardization that nowadays matches very well the trends of the global market, but it is based on previous roots that have to do with humanistic studies.
So now, please, if you have a question, who would like to start? I always say that if there are not questions, probably there are some insults or comments. You'll say.
I will ask kind of in English and Spanish. So, le type and el tipo in Spanish doesn't translate to the type in English, right? So, what would be your translation? Because it also relates to a guy, right? El tipo se refiere a una persona. It refers to a person, but also to the type of person. So, what would be your take on that translation?
Should I answer in Spanish or English? I was asking myself. She asked about the reason untranslatable between the Spanish, the French, and the Romance language, and this El Tipo makes this double thing, this guy and the type. In English, it's not translated in the same way. Yes, it is a case of difficulty for the translation and something that we have to target. And probably that's why this text was not translated because this is so hard to translate and it is key. So to say the Spanish type, we have a literal translation as a Spanish type. That doesn't mean a thing in English. And that the type español, he has a Spanish type. It looks Spanish, but it's not the same. And also, there is this philosophically fundamental word, which is the type, and with that, we leave aside the appearance to the generic, and also this aspect of this group. So the argument that I would say can only be said in Spanish, French, between Spanish and French, and the English are kind of blind about it. It's too bad for you. But we must have it in Spanish and also in French. And for the English speakers, we'll have to say this happens, it is what it is. And as the principle of translatability, this is the principle of economy. This is happening, and I can explain it to you in 50 or 40 uh, lines, but not in a word.
I can tell you what's going on in the word tipo in Spanish, but I can't tell you in one word. And that's typical of the problem of translation between languages.
Ahora sí. Hola,
Hi,
Jacques.
Jacques. I remember that in the seminar that had to do with the translation, that it was from the 80s, and Pierre Menara was written, the author of the Quixote, was a student of Spanish studies, and the student said, or proposes to say that the translation into French of Pierre Menard will be something of the most original translation of the Pierre Menard, but they say yes or no, and they say no, because Pierre Menard has had a French atmosphere, and that is the one that will be missed in the translation into French. These Frenchy things will be missing, that is in the Spanish of Borges, is the ones that we will lose in the translation into French. And regarding this other typography that is part of the Pirmena in the Spanish, that at the same time it will be lost in the translation, I would like to ask you about that. And if from that point onwards, you can see this notion of untranslatability or translatability in Kazan. Yes. The definition that Kazan offers for untranslatability and translatability really covers a lot and also is quite capable and quite generous. I feel that there is a certain allergy that I get to the use of that definition because, last but not least, it is a use that will take us to some sort of ideal of the untranslatability of an ipso factus fact that cannot reconcile with the global market. I think that that is not correct. I think that we need to give a step forward. And when talks about a word that cannot be translated, a word that we cannot stop loving or wanted to translate, this is something true, but it's not enough. You're not being able to or to want to translate something is given in a context that is given and that is a historic context because every word is defined by different situation. But she will never deny this, and she would say that the project of the Vocabulary Europeo Philosophy, it is a moment of the consolidation of the European project that is something that has as a main area the thinking of the European Union as a bloc, as a linguistic bloc and political and economic that is unique. And also, the European vocabulary of philosophy is trying to establish once again the vocabulary to return their language to their philosophical expressions. It means that this is something that is set between 1995 and 2004, and it will have its moment in history. But that very same pattern, we have to apply it to the principle of untranslatability, that this desire of continuing defining or the need that we feel of desire and need, it is also that is affected by a concrete historical situation. It's not the same to desire something in 1995 that desire something in 1989. The structure of the desire is another one, is something different because the family is different, because the relationship with the parents is a different one. The market is another one because of the reasons that we might think. And every one of the processes of that proposal must be said in a radical manner, and she's not able to do so. She could do, but the ones that comes after her cannot. So my difference with Catan is we look block the use is too ideal for the concept of translatability. And I do not agree with her because she doesn't make the link between translation and the flow of commodities that I do because that is my thing, that is my area. I hope so. Yes, asking if we were able to translate that.
Thank you so much. I'm still digesting the talk. It's kind of a follow-up of the previous question. I was wondering if you would reflect on the fact that Kessan's work is about is the philosophical lexicon, and whether there's something specific about translation of philosophical concepts which necessarily work in a constellation with other concepts. I'm also thinking how concepts have a life that is given to them in relationship to the form of life that brings that concept to life. Right. And not only in a Wittgensteinian way, but also in an Aristotelian way. What happens when that concept that enacts a particular form of life then is translated into another world, and whether this problematic can be thought in relationship to market economy, insofar as market economy itself is a project rooted in a specificity of capitalism. Thank you.
Presumably, there are two limit cases to translation. Esto, ¿cómo hacemos? ¿Lo contesto en castellano? Ah, sí. Si la
question was, you were asking, given that the Costonian project has to do with the philosophical concept and the lexicon of philosophy, the proposal of untranslatability can be separated the philosophy itself. And there is a question about the philosophical concept and the ways of life. And given that the way of life that the philosophical concept express are ways of life which are totally local or totally ecological, so to speak, what will happen when we submit that difference between the ways of life to the global market, which is an expression of a way of life that is specific in a specific moment in history and in a certain way of thinking in a specific manner. So that is a quite rich question that I will try to answer maybe in Spanish. I guess in Spanish. Okay. It will be two horizons, obvious horizons for the translation. When we go to the drugstore and we ask for an aspirin, there is no problem with the translation because in the last moment we know what is it about. I'm not going to go to a drugstore asking for a paint. So there is a concept that will set a technical relationship with the language at the drugstore. Okay, so far so good. Doesn't happen when we are talking about poetry, as we have been able to see in the last two meetings, and it doesn't happen in the philosophy as well. So philosophy and poetry are in different ways some limits for the project of translation because they do not depend of a technical construction or a instrumental one of the language. And that is why a project, we can say that the poetry is untranslatable because the major concept of the poetry are of the philosophy are untranslatable because there are two different things. In the case of the philosophy, where I work, project of the vocabulary of European philosophy has to do with a political aspect, looking for return the genealogy and also in the uses the biggest concept of the of the philosophy to its original and specific history. It has to do with political aspects and philosophical ones because it understands, doesn't understand that philosophy, when it is submitted to a political regime of a market regime, this is going to tend to disappear the concrete genealogy of different terms that are even bigger from the Greek, German, Spanish even. Need to rescue the way of expressing this, the type, the specific type of the expression, and not to formalize everything or to turn that into a philosophical globish. For me, this is an important project, but probably this is a project that it is impossible. I don't know very well if it is possible to take the genealogy of the words in this manner without getting into the linguistic nationalism and and the words and reactionary part of uh, idealism of Heidelberg that can be very dangerous. No, I've got the design, and you just have the to be, and you're screwed because design is way more important. Design is way more important than just being. As a matter of fact, in German, I know how to express the fundamental orientation of the ontology in such a manner that you will never be able to do so. And the poor Greeks, at some point they mentioned it, but it was over 2,000 years ago. And back then, they just had been talking about the dollar. It's not even worth to consider that. So that can lead us to a reestablishment of the vocabulary of the philosophical language.
So maybe necessarily it will go towards that direction of capturing the project of the reestablishment of the vocabulary, and it could be captured by fascism in this sense. So we have to be very, very careful with that. At least that is my opinion. So everything that I'm telling you is that on one hand, I think it is key look for this project to find out more about this project of the hypothesis of the untranslatable, but at the same time, we have to be aware that that very same project can lead us to the worst of the situations. And now to your last point, was it that if I'm not putting above of other ways of living, the way of living, which is the way of living of the market, when making this analogy between the processes of the market and the process of translation? So I would say that yes, in that case, I am, yes, putting a way of living on top of others, above others. And this is a way of living of the Western modern world and the market as it was created by the Western modern world. And this is something that I'm doing because I'm talking from within a critical tradition which was shaped by the modern Western world. So I'm trying to be critical from within, from inside that discourse itself. I fully understand that there are alternatives to that way of living, but I would suggest that from within the discourse of the Western modern philosophy, there are certain critical devices that allow us to think about the end of the capital. Well, thank you so much. I wanted to ask you a very quick question regarding the relationship between translation, value, and how to approach this from the idea of unproductive labor from Marx. How to think about untranslatability when there is no possibility of value traveling. The good thing about non productive work, there are so many things that are great about non-productive work, but I was trying to point towards that direction without being explicit when I was talking about this worker who is on holidays, which is not the same as non-productive work. Of course, you can always frame holidays within this idea of production and productivity. Non-productive work, however, cannot. So, being on vacations is nothing but a way of describing what would be the alternative to the globish, which is the possibility of being on holidays within the language of the capital, which is an alternative to the globish. The globish works all the time, but non productive work or non-productive labor is another alternative to the globish because it is work, but it is not productive in a way that a value can be captured within the capital. And how does it work when it comes to translation? I would say that, funnily enough, I would say that translation, the invisible translation, for instance, when I said it's cold and you understood that perfectly fine, or when I go to the drugstore and in German, I ask for an aspirin and I am understood in Spanish because of how it sounds. That is non-productive labor, I would say, because it produces what it has to produce. There is an exchange of value, but it does not add value of any type whatsoever. So it is completely neutral, I would say, regarding the work. It is hardly work at all. So translation, which is completely technical, instrumental, and invisible, is non-productive work. So when we say that, we are saying very controversial things. Among those, if you imagine the model or the layout of a factory, that is a model of continuous production, but it is also a model of translation, or if the translation is like a factory, then when a certain object, where a certain good is produced in the factory, and they keep producing the same object or the same good, and it is produced in a mechanical manner, in a standardized manner, then you are actually doing non-productive work in the sense that or up to a certain point because you are not producing the extra value, for instance, the cultural value of work, which is the basis or that enables the work of the factory itself. I will put this in other words. In order to have a factory, you need to produce something, and on top of the object or the good that you are producing, you have to produce some added value, some cultural added value, so that working in a factory is a good idea, so that there isn't a drive for a revolution, for instance, and that cultural added value, which is produced, it is produced by a mismatch between the labor and the object or the good which is produced. There is a mismatch there. So if there's only productive work, there isn't a production of added value in order to create the possibility of having an ideology that would promote you or encourage you to work in that manner. So, and that is why I believe that this analogy thing that we translate, everything that we just untranslatability or some of the hegemony, and that at the same time it allows you to be critical to the productive. I don't understand myself, but I am trying to explain myself. It seems to me that with the word productive and this idea, we wrap up. Thank you so much.